This essay is called The Deleuzean Archetype. In philosophy, one of the most notorious works of the modern era is Capitalism and Schizophrenia by Gilles Deleuze and Guattari. Michel Foucault really liked this book and saw it as a polemic opposed to fascism and conformity. Bataille was influenced by Deleuze because of the freedom to associate different, polemical, and contradictory concepts. By the 20th century, continental philosophy had begun to develop significantly, and many of the works that come out of that period are not easily intelligible. Philosophy had become extremely creative, but also extremely dense, and not everybody historically liked this new tradition of philosophy. But in terms of thinking freely, or at least attempting to do so, the new forms that philosophers were discovering were proving to be very influential, and for a variety of reasons. I have read a lot of Deleuze, but I'll admit I don't always know what he is talking about. The terms are very obscure, the concepts not so easy to follow, and philosophy departments rarely take Deleuze seriously as a consequence. But I think this is a mistake. The experiment that Deleuze was taking part of was extremely interesting to me, and for a variety of reasons. Deleuze postulated through his writing the idea that thinking can be extremely free from coercion and influence and control, or at the very least, it can be free to explore novel associations, to come up with new conclusions. Deleuze was especially interested in thinking about these concepts in the context of schizophrenia and mental illness. With the exception of Foucault, this hadn't really been done before, when philosophy historically often prided itself on being super-logical and super-analytic. It wasn't irrational or, dare I say, schizophrenic. For my intents and purposes, I find it interesting that Deleuze focused on mental illness and treated it philosophically. What I believe has developed from the writing of Deleuze is my notion of the Deleuzean archetype. To me, this is the schizophrenic who thinks in such a way that is so separate from the norm that, through his delusions and mania, he can experience the world in a novel way, and come up with ideas that have never been heard before. Cut off from society, the schizophrenic can develop novel conceptions, can think purely, coming up with a system of thought that is new and unprecedented. Pure thought often leads to exclusion from society, but in the hands of Deleuze, this is an important process for the development of ideas. As important as the component of mental illness is to my conceptions, I am even more taken in by this archetype that Deleuze postulates in the context of ideas. I have had many people tell me before that my thinking doesn't fit the norm, but I am a little bit rebellious in that way, determined to work it out for myself. I have had people tell me that original thought doesn't exist, but I don't believe this. In my understanding, we should strive to be as free-thinking as we possibly can, because free thinking is often a loaded term that is associated with what I see as super-rigid thinking. I want to use the phrase pure thinking instead, as I think this is a little bit closer to what Deleuze had in mind. The point is to develop pure thought. Is it possible to think so purely that your ideas are your own, they are original, and they're completely untainted by society? This is a very good question. I have argued before for open thought, and I am often determined to encourage the idea that our thinking not be influenced by the world around us, or even by our own biological constraints. While in these cases I always acknowledge that there are limits to what people can think because of the finite world around us, I nonetheless think that it is important we strive for pure thought, even if people laugh you out of the room and think you're literally insane. The point of art isn't always to be original, or at least 100% original. But when I think of my experiences where people have often tried to limit what I think, or what I write, or what I say, I can't help but feel a surge of rebellion against these straitjacket ideas. I want to be able to be the Deleuzean archetype, where I can develop my own system of thought without too much intrusion. I want my thinking to be as pure as it can be. This is impossible when we are certainly influenced by the many things around us, but I believe it to be a noble goal, because I think there's a lot of potential with the possibility of pure thinking, to the point to where your thinking becomes highly original and where it is your own ideas that animate you. While people do not think that pure thinking is really possible, and while I would acknowledge that influences do change the way that we think about things, we can still participate in the exercise of pure thought and think the way that a schizophrenic person thinks whenever they are deeply embedded in their own world and reality. We can create thoughts, ideas, and writings that exist separate from the cruel world around us. Of course, I understand the downside of this kind of thinking, the idea that people do not find your ideas to be as accessible whenever you are focusing more on originality and purity. But it is important to remember that the point of having pure thought is a moral consideration, not a way of comparing to other thinkers and intellectuals in the world. The point isn't to be better than any other thinker or philosopher. The point is to contribute your own system of thought, your own analysis, your own worldview, regardless of the pressures to conform. I always thought that John Nash was a good example of this historically, because not only did he have schizophrenia, which influenced his thinking, but he also sought to avoid influences and to come up with his own conclusion, specifically with his mathematical reason. Personally, I have no problem with influences because I think influences can make us richer in our own analysis. But, being schizophrenic myself, I know what it is like to exist in a world where people cannot relate to what you're saying. And rather than turning this intensity down, I say instead, ratchet it up. This is because I believe that pure thinking can make the world better in a variety of ways, if only we are willing to see it. Your thinking can create new pathways in the minds of others. It can help us perceive the world differently, as well as help the individual thinker see things differently, and I think that there is definitely value in this. When I read philosophies such as by Deleuze, I've been taken in by this attempt to perceive the world in a new, creative light. Why limit your thinking? If I am writing books that people probably aren't going to read anyway, I may as well write something that contains my own experience, by way of what I hope can be pure thought, or at least as close to pure thought as it can possibly be. The reason why I think pure thinking is so important is because it allows people to have a different perspective whenever they engage with you. It is a moral consideration, because often in life we are told how to think, we are told how to perceive the world, we are told what to believe and what to say and how to act. We are forced to conform to a system that doesn't care about us. Our ideas don't matter to the monolithic system. And no one cares about innovation, change, or originality. While I'm not completely opposed to norms per se, I feel as though it is too easy to get lost in the procedural mechanism that is society, and we forget other important values such as creativity, novelty, and innovation. We forget that there are other ways that we can view the world, because we get so caught up in a corporate model of reality, or in the words of Deleuze, we get caught up in the capitalistic machine. It is not what we want. We want the intelligentsia to challenge us. We want them to challenge the way that we look at things. But even with the social considerations of originality and pure thinking, one of the biggest reasons why I identify with the Deleuzean archetype is for very personal reasons. I don't like being told what to believe, when I know such coercion is done in bad faith, and not to make the world better in any way. I don't have a problem with being persuaded per se, but I feel like in so many ways we are not allowed to think for ourselves, and to come up with our own conclusions. I turn up that desire tenfold. I want to be able to do my own thinking and come to my own conclusions without being forced or coerced into thinking about things a certain way. Just because the system we use to develop our worldviews are powerful doesn't mean that they are right. The problem with ideas, then, and the communication of ideas, is that I really believe Nietzsche to be right. The ideas that are often dominant do not come from truth, but rather from power. We aren't encouraged to understand the truth, or even beauty, when we are told what to believe, say, and do. This was one reason why Michel Foucault liked Deleuze. It was his thinking on power structures and thoughts that allowed for Foucault to break out of that system and to come up with his own conclusions about society, the mind, and philosophy. This is a very important process for developing something meaningful. Of course, it isn't easy to be an archetype, much less a Deleuzean one, where pain of exclusion and even the pain of mental illness will lead to suffering. It is not easy to do your own thinking. So many people have before not believed in me, but what I finally realized was that they can have their own system of thought, while I am going to branch out and develop my own. This is my choice. I'm choosing to be the schizophrenic archetype, to postulate ideas that are never going to be recognized as valuable or meaningful. It is a way of staying true to your vision, of articulating something that is valuable and beautiful, and that is also moral in its own way. Original thought is tantalizing, and I am not going to have people tell me what kind of material I should write and how I should think about the world. We should be free to develop our own considerations, and we should be free to be able to do this for the betterment of mankind. Original ideas are very valuable, new ideas that challenge and innovate. We need them, because they allow us to see things differently. There is value in it. There is value in bringing a different perspective. I hope that I never lose sight of this.